Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nightlight Astrology's Weekend Wisdom Series. I'm Whitney Kranz. We've got Alexandra Blair, who's laughing at me, and the one and only Alex Amorosi. What's up, guys?
I started to raise my hands when I heard Alex. I didn't wait until you get to Andra.
Yeah. When you get the influencer ick halfway through, cringing yourself.
Oh, I love it. Well, we're starting this Saturday off with some giggles, which is great because we've got a pretty freaking intense new moon to look at. Today, we're going to focus on the new moon in Scorpio. It happens to be a new moon in electric Cazimi at the same time, and we're going to sort out what this astrology means. But before we dive into it, we are so grateful to be here on the Nightlight Astrology channel. Adam Ellenboss is an incredible teacher and astrologer himself. If you are interested in studying astrology with Adam, you can still join the Year 1 Astrology Certification course. It actually begins today, so it is not too late. So head over to nightlightastrology.com to check that out and all of his other offerings. Before we get into it, the intensity of this new moon, what's going on, guys? How's it going today?
It's great. Now, I just wrote a newsletter on the full moon we've just had in Taurus, which to me was like a chef's kiss of a full moon.
It was so sweet.
Right? Just so sweet, right? It's
restful.
Just like Uranus isn't there, right? There's no more lunations and, newer full moons in Taurus with Uranus there. So Uranus was still in Gemini. Venus was hosting from her home sign. Venus was still in aspect to Jupiter. Wonderful, lovely, stable, life-giving full moon. Now, we're coming to the Scorpio full moon, which is in order to have all that wonderful new life-generating, regenerative stuff from the Taurus new moon, full moon rather, something's got to go, and something's going. Something has got to go on the compost heap. Something has got to be reviewed. It's time to take stock of where my cabinet's too full and empty them out, because this is one of the most interesting new moons I think I've seen in a really long time.
Yeah, I agree. It's really unique, the lineup that's happening in Scorpio, but also the fact that it's directly through degree-based aspect tied into these water trines being supported by Jupiter and Saturn. And I was thinking of Bernadette Brady's description of the trine as a time when all obstacles fall away. So it's almost like, yes, there's something that needs to go, and there are no excuses left to fail to remove that thing from your life. Like, it is well and truly time to cut the rot away. I think every single analogy I'm going to have is going to be like some dark, edgy, silly thing. But it's like a very stark lunation, and one that I really like, actually.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. I think the intensity is well warranted, well granted. I think it's really interesting. Alex, you mentioned coming off of this full moon in Taurus, and that full moon in Taurus was not devoid of Uranian influence, right? Because immediately after, we had Mars moving into Sagittarius to oppose Uranus. And so I think we've been primed a little bit for this energy, because now what we're going to see, and I'll bring up the screen here so we can share, is that we've got a new moon, Mercury Cazimi, directly opposite Uranus. Can you guys see the chart on the screen?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. But now I can't see you, my friends. Where did you go?
Right here.
There you are.
We're still here.
Okay, good.
Hello.
All right. So this new moon in Scorpio happens on November 20th. Here in my time zone, Central Time, it's 12:27 a.m. So this is one of those that could actually happen technically on the day before if you're, like, say, in Pacific time zone. But you can see here that we've got this new moon pile up down here at exactly 28 degrees. Mercury is retrograde, coming back exactly into this new moon in what we call its inferior cazimi, right? That's the cazimi moving in retrograde motion. And obviously then opposite here, Uranus, who is also retrograde back in Taurus. And like Alexandra mentioned, we've got this big old water trine energy with this new moon exactly trining Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus. And what does that make? Oh, Saturn and Neptune, thank you. Mm-hmm. I was looking at the top. I was looking at Uranus here.
It's a very Uranian situation happening here.
Right, because basically what we've got here is another one of these kites forming in the sky, and the new moon and Mercury are holding the tension of that kite with Uranus up there. Meanwhile, we have the ruler, Mars, over here doing who knows what in Sagittarius. Maybe a little distracted, I don't know. What do you guys think about this astrology? It's not nothing, that's for sure.
I think that, so, what's interesting here is just noticing, and I hadn't thought about it this way before, Jupiter and Saturn look like the adults in the room for this new moon. Mm-hmm. Like, just sitting in trines to it, sort of just like the better angels sitting on your shoulder, a little restrained, a little hope, but Uranus has that feeling of like, now. I want to do whatever I'm doing now. I want it out of the closet now. I want it, like there's that feeling of, and if I don't, Uranus has that restless feeling when you're not kind of bowing to those impulses that often come up with it. And so I feel like having Jupiter and Saturn here is really, really helpful because it's a little bit like you're having the big sudden feels, but you have the ability to take a breath, sit down for 5 minutes, and be with what those feels are before you take action on them. Or at least there's the opportunity to do that. Sometimes with Uranus involved, who knows? You just take the keys to the car and go. But, I think that having the ruler of the new moon under the rulership of Jupiter is helpful. I think that let's just say if Mars was also conjunct this would be a very different story. But I think that Mars is tempered a little bit by Jupiter here is important. I think that there's room for a lot of simultaneously expansive, action-oriented thinking with Mars and Sagittarius here. At the same time, the things feel like they may be degenerating or withering or moving away or being sort of withdrawn at the same time. I think it's also possible you want to watch the urge to become too overconfident on too little evidence with this new moon too. That's the Mars and Sagittarius ruling it, right? Too overconfident in your own feeling maybe, or too overconfident in your own assessment of what's going on. Because a water trine, you need some time to sit with water. You need some time to be with what those feelings are. And Mars and Sag sometimes can be like, the evangelist, right? Like, I just say this passionate view that I have and I'm saying it. And just taking a second, like, is this actually something that's going to serve my highest and best interest? Is this actually what I'm feeling? Like, real mindful discernment is helpful and really necessary with a lot of water in the air from my point of view.
Yeah, I'm totally hearing that too. And it had me thinking of, as I was looking at this lunation before, some of these really high stakes situations that we've had in the world and in our history where a decision that needed to wait, like there was some piece of this decision that needed the process of waiting. I was thinking of Stanislav Petrov, actually, the so-called man who saved the world, who essentially was in charge of Russian nuclear missile response, and at some point saw what he believed in his gut to be a fake alert that the U.S. had launched these nuclear weapons, and decided to just based on his gut instinct, report it as an error and basically avoided nuclear war across the world because of this during the Cold War. So I was kind of thinking of that. And you know what other book was really coming up for me with that Mars and Sagittarius is Into Thin Air, which I pulled out just to look at. And now I don't know if you've read this, but it's the story of the deadliest expedition to Mount Everest in history. And the story of the way that people believe they will make it to the top of Everest. They see clouds rolling in. They feel their bodies failing them. They are passing by other failed expeditions like the detritus and the trash and sometimes the bodies of people who have failed before them. And it's almost like every step makes their determination stronger in this really strange way. I feel like this is a little bit of that energy in this lunation. And I don't want to overly sensationalize because it's a lunation, right? We're not talking about climbing Everest, but it does feel a little bit like the Hunger Games. You know, somebody's going to win and everybody truly believes they're going to be that person. But at the end of the day, you know, this is a mixed bag lunation. It feels like what your relationship with Scorpio and with Mars has a lot to say about whether you're the person who's waiting or whether you're waiting on someone else, whether your belief is going to get you to the top or whether your belief is going to fail you.
Oh my gosh, that was really beautiful, Alexandra. And I love that you brought the instinctual drive into it, because I think that I can feel that just sort of like emanating from this chart, right? But I'm looking at the lunation there at the bottom of the screen in the depths of the chart, right? And it's almost feeling like this navigation of the depths that we're doing, right? And how is our wisdom, that's the water trine energy that you were speaking to, Alex, the wisdom and intuition like leading us down that sort of path. And one of the things, Alexandra, you said on a past episode about these water trines was like the tie to ancestral lineage,
sure.
right? The tie to those, like the ancestral wisdom or the intuition that comes through our lineages and our bloodlines. And so I feel like there's a tie-in to that, right? Like at the same time, we're climbing Everest and there's this like sense of, I mean, okay, look where Mars is. Mars is right at the bending of the nodes, like the north bending, right? So is there this like sense of destiny and drive and this sort of like hunger that we're coming into right now, that at the same time we're sort of climbing and like trying to reach our destiny and its nodes, so maybe it's a callback to eclipse season, we're also needing to really like search deep within ourselves, like maybe even to our past ancestors to help sort of bolster us forward.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're saying that, Whitney. I'm thinking a lot about like the need to balance the big picture with precision, right? The Mars and Sagittarius, and you know we talk about this with Mercury and Sagittarius too, is a little bit like, you know, Sagittarius is like, could you just summarize that for me? Like, could you just put it in bullet points, send me 5 bullet points and I'm good, right? So this big picture, like I want to look at the more abstract, big philosophical meaning of something, but you can also get lost in that abstract without really drilling down into like, what is the thing that needs to be spoken, felt, heard, known, whatever it is, very precisely in order to move you forward into that bigger image. And that's where I see the moon, the new moon here, relative to that Mars and Sagittarius too, is this idea of, you know, one of the things that's also going on here to further the point is the moon is in her fall at the very end of Scorpio, about to pick up dignity and move into a sign ruled by Jupiter. So there's something about like knowing what has to fall away or be degenerated. That's just the word that keeps coming to me. That suddenly, oh, here's a bigger picture I had not seen before. Here's a way of seeing or visioning or understanding and taking action on that I had not seen before, that comes relatively quickly. Now, Mercury, is still retrograde in Scorpio for, you know, a little bit after this, but I think there's something about this balance between knowing what's going on the big level, taking action on that, but not losing sight of like the precise underground motivations, compulsions, drives, passions that are also present that may be driving that behind the scenes that you're not seeing. That's the Scorpio aspect to me.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a question of vision that's happening with Mars and Sagittarius. And this lunation is almost saying, do you trust the vision? Do you trust it enough to cut out these things that are rotting, to actually let go? I saw this image on an oracle card recently that's just been sticking with me, and it was somebody across a chasm, and they had their hands on one side and their feet on the other, and they were like, should I let go of my hands first? Should I let go of my feet first? It's like, you just have to fall. You actually just have to let go, and there's no perfect way to fall or pretty way to fall. Not that this lunation is telling me that people are going to fall, but just to say, do you trust the vision? Do you trust what's going on here enough to make the sacrifices you need to make? I think that's such a good point about the moon coming into Sagittarius, where it will pick up dignity. And I think you're reinforcing what you said earlier, Alex, as well, about Jupiter and Saturn really being the adults in the room. It does feel like from afar they're encouraging, especially when the moon comes into Sagittarius and picks up that dignity. And one last thing I wanted to say that I am looking at here is that this lunation, because it's happening so late in Scorpio, it's actually happening in a sextile to Pluto, even though it is across that sign boundary. Pluto's not in Capricorn, so in a whole sign way, it's not sextile, but by degree, it's certainly right there. So there is something that feels very Plutonic about this moon. And if you watched our Scorpio Dignities episode, you will know that we're all Pluto, Scorpio, synastry truthers. We believe that, and we've seen that. So some of that could just be picked up from the sign of Scorpio, but it does feel like Pluto is really an ally over there, and maybe even whispering some words of some dark little words of encouragement on the nighttime. It's like a night jasmine scented breeze where little whispered words of encouragement for your transformation are coming into your life.
Oh, yes.
Love that.
Yes, the night jasmine.
Bring on the jasmine.
Okay, but wait, like Saturn daddy is here and Jupiter daddy is here. And, they're all making sure that we're like really tapping into the meat of what it is we're about to leap into or dive into. And when I'm, at this point, right, with the moon moving and the sun both moving immediately into Sagittarius and Mercury traveling backwards, there's like this like passing of information that's happening, right? And like I'm thinking of it almost like a like a truth test, or like a lie detector for our souls, like Alex, you were saying evidence, something about the evidence, like Mercury wants or maybe we're like overconfident in the evidence, right? What's the evidence? And I feel like maybe Mercury is coming back to this point, to this Cazimi point, in search of testing the evidence. Is it true? Like what we're revealing and digging out of the depths, is it true? Is it right? Is it something that will stand up to, Saturn daddy and Jupiter daddy, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm getting.
First of all, I see Saturn and Jupiter buying a lovely home in a suburb. Very tasteful. Well painted and appointed. Well painted.
I'm imagining
like
the bird cage. The bird cage.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Wait, and is there like a sunken living room too?
It's like of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Of course. Yeah. So I love Saturn Jupiter Daddy. That should be our theme now for the rest of the time they're in trine.
Okay, perfect. All the water trines.
But really, I love this because I think we've all had moments. Here's my Sagittarius generalization, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we've all had moments where we have believed something, we have maybe wanted to believe something, we have tried to make ourselves believe something that has, we felt had a grand philosophical, meaningful purpose, but then you just find out either the evidence isn't there or it's not true for you. It really, at the base of your heart, when you go down into your solar plexus and you feel into what's actually true for you, it's like, this isn't actually who I am, or this isn't actually what I want, or this isn't actually what I want to do. And I love that idea about this being sort of the truth test or the lie detector, right? Where Mercury moves through this moon, it's just like, is this grand vision represented by Mars and Sagittarius, or this grand philosophical belief system, do you actually believe it, or do you still believe it? Or have you received new evidence? Or have you gone deeper inside yourself and said, you know what? This is actually the route I want to go. And this other route has been what it's needed to be for this point in my life. But now I need to go down this place where it's like, I feel much more in alignment with who I am. Because Scorpio, and if we're going to put Pluto in the sextile for sure here, it just doesn't let you get away with that, like, kind of fooling or deluding yourself. You know when you're doing it. You know when you're not listening to that little voice that's really, really deep inside you. And this is a great opportunity to hear it and put it to the test. Just put it to the test, to really be honest. Not always easy to do, for sure, but to really be honest with what the answers are for you.
Yeah, Alex, that's brilliant. I think even building on that some people are going to be feeling a sort of inverted version of that, where you are forced to look your fundamental misbelief in the mirror. So yes, you may have a conviction that's not true. On the other hand, you may be going, why can't I finally have blank? And you might be looking your blockers in the eye for the first time, frankly, here, and saying, I actually have to trench out this fundamental misbelief. With the moon in Scorpio, my mind naturally goes to something like a scarcity mentality. Why can't I make money? Why can't I make money? Well, you're terrified of losing it. So you're not making it, like you won't open your bank account. So of course you're not making money. So there might be like a fundamental misbelief that just, it's time. It's actually time. I think that could be a good way to use this lunation intentionally, specifically because we have Uranus and Mercury both retrograding back. So if you take Uranus and Mercury out of the picture and you look at this, it's kind of a sweet moon. So it's like Mercury and Uranus must be the negative space of that intensity that we're talking about. And both of them are retrograde, and they've retrograded back into this snare. Go deep inside yourself and trench out whatever that misbelief is, even if you don't believe it's false yet. It might be time to start that work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's the belief. I love how you're pointing out, Alexandra, that it's like the belief in ourselves, right? And what we have inside, because this isn't about other people. It's like we have to do what we're learning here. It's something we have to do for ourselves, not others. Not in like a sad, you can't have relationships kind of a way. That would be the scarcity thinking, right? But that to have that relationship, like you need to, be your whole self first, individually and fully, right? And like, I'm just tying that to when I first saw the chart for this particular new moon. Actually, it wasn't when I first saw it. It was like the second time I looked at it. And I was like, this is so electric, and the electricity is running through Scorpio. It's like an electric eel. I think I mentioned that like on our last Mercury retrograde episode, that I had this image of an electric eel. Well, then Whitney, doing what she does, went down the frickin' rabbit hole on electric eels, which are not actually eels at all, interesting enough. But I promise, come along with me, this ties in, because eels, the electric eels that like light up the depths in the darkness, like they're not sending shock waves to like kill their prey. They are, or like in some malicious way, like they are lighting these shock waves for their own like self-survival, right? It's not like a malicious sort of hunting. It's like to fulfill their own needs. And that just came back to me like little sparks as you were talking about the need to like, this is what we're digging up for ourselves, not other people.
That level too of, it's so interesting how sometimes the things we most need to see, the things like the blockers, I love that phrase, Alexandra, that they are the hardest things to see, and they're terrifying sometimes. They're Scorpio-like, right? They're very like, they're intense. Sometimes you don't even necessarily know what exactly it is, but it's just a feeling of some kind. But when you're able to excavate it, there's a sense where like, it's like you've unclogged the drain. Like it's just, the water can flow again. You feel better. It's the quintessential quality of both Pluto and Scorpio, which is sort of restoring the flow of energy in life after something has withered and become toxic or become stagnant, putrid in some way. And I think the sense of like lighting up your own path or lighting up for yourself comes from a place in this particular new moon of addressing something like that. But I don't think it's going to have the quality of like intensity or the feeling of like freneticness that it might have if Jupiter and Saturn Daddy weren't there taking care of it. Because Jupiter and Saturn Daddy are stabilizing forces here. Both of them are very stabilizing in different ways. And I think that it's like, okay, I saw that. That was tough, but phew, I'm glad I did. And now I can clear that out. Now I can move on. And now, especially as the moon picks up dignity and, the sun will move into Sagittarius just 2 days later, there's this, and be ruled by Jupiter, there's a sense where all of a sudden now we're seeing beneficial, or at least understanding where the context of those decisions is taking us, right? Because that's all about Jupiter ruled signs, is the idea of context. You get a greater sense of like, okay, there's a contextual idea here. Even though that was uncomfortable, I feel a lot better. That sort of feeling.
Yeah, I'm just writing a note down about that because I think when we visualize the trine as a triangle, it kind of reminds me of a buttress that would go under a roof. It's supportive. So thinking about Saturn and Jupiter, and here are all of these classic Saturn Jupiter keywords: mentors, coaches, sages, mystics, who might be supporting you. That is the role that they're playing right there. They're buttressing what's happening in Scorpio with their wisdom and with their largesse and their knowledge. And something that strikes me is that it has actually been, I didn't do the math, but this is happening on the 28th degree of Scorpio. So it has been something like 28 days of Scorpio season. You've had 28 days to be feeling this. And in fact, when the sun moved into Scorpio, the moon was in Scorpio. So there was this false start new moon that happened at the beginning of Scorpio season even. This is probably not a new lesson. Also indicated by the two planets prominently playing roles that are retrograde. This could be a really cool moment for some courage and to take a bet on yourself, to do a big bet on you and your own ability to navigate this. Now, I'm not saying let's learn these lessons. I'm not saying power through to the top of Everest if it's clear you're not going to make it to Everest. But I think there could be some really good energetic stuff available for people who are wanting to bet on themselves here too.
I just want to say quickly on that, Alexandra, and all those planets moving into Scorpio have been running into Pluto as they do so. So it's like, I just think that's such a valuable point. It's like you've already kind of excavated the dig, so to speak. You have like, you're looking at it. I just think that really is such to be emphasized because you have Scorpio and you had all of this Pluto. Pluto just kept digging stuff up as all these planets come in and run into the squares,
Yes, absolutely. And so then isn't this saying, like, isn't Mars in this position here with this moon kind of giving us like, ready or not, like, let's go, right? And Jupiter and Saturn there in this trine, it's a water trine, right? It's telling us to like trust the currents and flow with the currents, because what's coming up now from the depths is part of our journey, part of actualizing our journey,
Yeah, absolutely. It's gonna be an interesting one for sure. I'm very curious. I'm always curious to see when we talk about it and then see how it actually plays out.
Yeah. Like, were we right? Did we get it right?
Did we
Yes,
hit every
we got
archetypal topic perfectly?
Yeah, we got it right. I can tell you already. No.
Come back and let us know your new moon stories.
Yeah, there you go. I know. That's actually a good plug. We want to hear your stories. We want to hear your comments. How has Scorpio season been treating you? What are you expecting out of this new moon? Do you have planets or placements here? That was like 12 questions, right? So let us know in the comments. We've got some, can I say together, fun intensity to look forward to. Like, I am actually looking forward to this.
I'm really looking forward
Yeah.
to this, actually.
Yeah.
Great tagline for this full moon. New moon. Yeah.
Fun intensity. I love it. Well, I think that, does anyone have closing thoughts to wrap us up? Were those them? I mean, we're in for it, but in a good way. We're like deep inside.
Uranus adds a little fun spice. Like, it may not, I think we talked about, like, the deep dark Scorpio stuff here, but something kind of fun could come along with this too. You just want to really take a look at it. Really take a look at it. Yeah. But Uranus is definitely the rebellious teenager in between the two daddies on this side here. So just be aware of that. That it's fun. Sometimes that can be fun. You just want to keep an eye on it. That's all.
Yeah, I think with lunations, it's easy to think, oh, this is something that's going to happen to me. And that may be true. But there is so much about our life that we can create and we can co-create. So I would say that I am planning on using this to do whatever intense, hard thing and cut out the stuff and target my fundamental misbeliefs would all be cool ways to use this. And maybe have a little fun. That sounds good, Alex, especially with the moon and sun moving into Sagittarius. There might be some clowning going on just a couple days in the future. So I'm excited about this lunation. Definitely let us know how it plays out in your life.
All of the above. I am the ready or not. Like, here we come. Exactly. I think if there's ever a time to trust your instincts, right, and navigate through that uncertainty and like amplify in a productive way the electricity of this moment, there's certainly magic here to hang on to, and to make at the same time. So what a great way to close it out. Alex, do you want to tell people where they can book a reading with you?
Yes, I do, and I actually had to think about it for a second. Hang on. www.alexamorosi.com. You can book readings and energy healing with me there. You can also follow me on Substack at The Subtle Universe. There is a free subscription, which is a new and full moon newsletter every month. And there are various levels of paid subscription.
Hey, my name is Chris Brennan. You're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Pallas K. Augustine, and we're going to be talking about the floating IC. Hey, my name is Chris Brennan. You're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Pallas K. Augustine, and we're going to be talking about the floating IC as a sensitive point and what happens when it falls in different whole sign houses in the chart besides the fourth whole sign house, and how it imports fourth house or IC significations, which then double up in the whole sign house that it falls in. So, hey, Pallas, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on the show. This is your first time on the show, and we've been talking about doing this for over a year now because you recently just published a book on the IC itself, right?
In 2022, when Jupiter in Pisces was conjunct my IC, we launched a Kickstarter to fund the IC and astrology of coming home. It was wildly successful, which was beautiful. I love my Kickstarter backers. And it took us a couple years to get it all together. Hugh Tran, a brilliant designer and astrologer, did the whole book too. And so it took us a couple years, but we got it. It was beautiful. And then the first run after we fulfilled the Kickstarter backers orders sold out immediately. So it took us a while to come out with a second edition. But now we have a second edition of the IC. It's an ebook and a print book, and it's available. So I am talking about it more. And it was wonderful to get your invitation to talk about this topic here because it's one I think and talk about a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And it was funny last year when we started talking about this because your book was coming out right as I was releasing or about to release my
Mhm.
deep dive into the fourth house in astrology. And I thought about doing one on the IC with you, but I wanted to finish the fifth house first because that's the other house where for a lot of people, the IC, the floating IC will either fall in the fourth whole sign house or the third whole sign house or the fifth whole sign house. And once I recently finally did the fifth house episode, which I've episodes that I've just released over the course of the past few weeks, I finished sort of collecting a lot of example charts for those placements and feel like I have a much clearer picture now about that placement, even though I've understood it for almost like 20 years now that I've been working with this concept of the IC as a floating point. Having demonstrated it, I feel good about now being able to have this discussion and talk about it more comprehensively, especially because one of the things that you did is we put out a survey over the past week asking for people for examples, and we actually got a lot of great submissions, right?
So many. Yeah, we got 245 over the course of just a couple days. And people were so vulnerable and sweet and honest. And I just want to extend a lot of gratitude to everyone who submitted. We can only talk about a handful today, but my research into this is ongoing. The IC book itself has 16 like in-depth client case stories about ICs and different signs, and then chart rulers in different whole sign houses as well. And so this work is just very near and dear to my heart, and it really touches me that people wanted to share, and we'll share a few of them today.
Brilliant. All right. Well, the majority of this episode will be us going through those submissions and talking about them. I'll mention or reiterate a few of the examples that I found during the course of doing the Houses series over the past year. But the main focus will be on sharing those chart examples that were submitted by listeners over the course of the past week. And then, of course, people can get a hold of your book. Right now, you're selling it exclusively through your website, right?
Through adolastellarum.com. There's a shop there, and you can get the print and the ebook versions.
Cool. All right. I'll put the link to that in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website entry for this episode. All right, so why don't we set a foundation first for everything in IC language by talking about the IC and talking about the fourth house and talking about this concept that originally, like 20 years ago, when I first came into astrology, and like, I mean, ironically, like many people, I heard about the concept of whole sign houses coming in as a Placidus, like modern astrology use, and I was like, that's not a good system. Like what that doesn't make any sense that the IC doesn't start with the degree of that the fourth house doesn't start with the degree of the IC. And I actually rejected the idea of whole sign houses for like the first year after I heard from it. It wasn't until I learned all of Hellenistic astrology and I learned the whole system and how the system works together that I started to understand that perspective better. And now it's been 20 years, literally 20 years of me reviving that and using that idea that the degree of the IC can float around the bottom part of the chart as a sensitive point and import functionally like IC or fourth house significations into whatever fourth whole sign house it falls. But a lot of this comes back to the symbolism of what the IC and the fourth house represent. And you are the resident expert in that. So where do we start with that discussion?
Oh, there's so many places to start. I just did a talk for the Washington State Astrological Association, and in that one, we used the concept of mycorrhizal fungi, who are basically the mycelium in the soil, who have a symbiotic relationship with the plants that grow in the soil. And it's a huge network, and it's how so many discoveries are being made about this kind of this fungal network, this mycelium, facilitating not only plant communication but also plant health. It acts almost as an immune system, and to me, the IC is so similar to that. And of course, it's sort of funny to talk about the IC out of relationship with the midheavens, since they're intertwined. They're the same axis, right? They
Mhm.
float together around the chart. And so to me, the midheaven are these, what gets planted, right? Like what blooms from the IC and the like mycelium that are down there. And it's a very common to talk about the IC through the metaphor of roots. And it is that for sure, both in the familial sense and also in the land sense. And of course, these are where we see the fourth house topics start to come out. But it's even more than that. Like in my research, time and time again, the IC connected people into not only their lineages of family and home, but also their lineages of culture and craft and vocation and place and art, right? And so when we start playing with, when we kind of liberate the IC and the midheaven from being only associated with the fourth and 10th, we start seeing, and if we work with clients, of course, I'm a consulting astrologer, all my work and research comes from my client research. It just opens up the possibilities for what people are able to see when they look at their IC. And so many people have such complicated relationships with their families that approaching the IC with this more open interpretation, which using it within a whole sign house system allows us to do, is just it's so much more generative for people as they look at their lives, they look at their lived experiences, and they try to track these stories. And the IC, the depths that are available there, I've seen it do just even a slight awareness, right? Like connecting into it, thinking about it, kind of returning it to its place in the chart as the foundation of the chart, really allowing people to honestly like gain like more confidence in their life and more understanding of their place. And when we work in a kind of even remotely deterministic model, we kind of need that to be able to understand like what we're doing here, right? And who we're connected with. And the IC is the strongest place that I've found that really connects people into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I like what you said there. One of the things that you mentioned that's interesting is like sometimes people have the perception that whole sign houses is more simplistic and less complex when you're not working with all of these intermediate cusps that are floating around. But ironically, when it comes to the IC floating around the bottom half of the chart and the MC floating around the top half, and then blending significations functionally of like two different like houses or domains or like ranges of significations together, it actually creates a much more complex and specific range of significations than you might expect. So there's actually a greater complexity to that approach that I think until you've had some experience working with it and talking with clients that have the IC in different houses that might be unexpected if you're not familiar with that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too, and we're not doing any fourth house IC examples today, since you covered much of that in your fourth house series, but there's a way that it actually allowing the IC, even if people are working in quadrant houses, allowing the whole sign counted from the ascendant to be part of the delineation of the midheaven and IC is a really powerful tool in this way. And it actually makes it more specific and special when the IC does fall in the fourth whole sign house, when it's not just given. So it's sort of part of like my pet theory about the whole thing in terms of connecting the work that we did in the book and the work that I do with clients into like the traditions that we're working within is that it's possible that the IC has taken on a lot of the fourth house significations because of its association with the fourth house cusp and quadrant systems, right? But that's not necessarily inherent. And certainly in many of the stories that we see, it's not an inherent connection to that familial rooting. And it's often when it's in a different house than the fourth, there's often an absence of that kind of familial rooting or land or real estate or these kind of fourth house topics, or those topics have we're able to reckon with fourth house topics in a in a way that we would reckon with any house topics, right? Rather than just immediately assuming that these are people's foundations that support their life and support their midheaven contributions.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's talk about that because that's something for me, it's like there's two ways to go about researching this and approaching it. On the one hand, and two ways that you really see it come up in practice. And one of those is just by looking at natal charts and looking at examples of charts where you have the fourth whole sign house and then you have the IC when it falls in usually either like let's say the fifth house or the third whole sign house. And that's one way of like approaching researching this topic. And then the second way of approaching researching it is the same thing, but instead looking at the sequence of what happens with the transits. So, for example, let's say the IC is in the fifth whole sign house. That means, for example, a person will get a Saturn transit that'll go through their fourth whole sign house for 2 or 3 years. And then immediately following that, they'll get a Saturn transit that will go through their fifth whole sign house, but it will also pass over their IC. And one of the things I've always shown is how you'll see a continuation of, for lack of a better word, like fourth house topics that go across the fourth whole sign house and the fifth whole sign house because of the presence of the IC extending some of those fourth house significations into the next sign. And that's one of the best ways to test this and show and see for yourself that it really does work, especially when you experience a transit like that. But for me, as a result of that, I don't make a lot of symbolic distinction between, or I see a lot of overlap between the fourth whole sign house having similar fourth house significations and the IC having or importing similar fourth house significations. Do you see it the same, or do you see it differently than how I've stated it there?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it happens with perfections as well, where you'll have a fourth house year, and that will bring in the rulers, significations of that. And then if you have your IC in the fifth, when you move into that house year, you're going to have you're going to have IC activations as well. And there's a piece there where it's, I mean, this is part of the fun and this is part of the research, right? Of figuring out, and especially when you're talking to clients and doing this work with clients and bringing this in, or you come across an IC activation and it's in a different, if it's in the third or it's in the fifth, and being able to help them parse apart like what is the fourth house versus what is the IC and what assumptions have we brought into that,
Mm,
and how does our IC function in relationship with our fourth house, no matter where the IC is, because
mhm,
that's a huge issue, and that comes out in many of the examples, right? It's like people, we actually, one of the funny things about the submissions is that I had to dig and dig and dig to find an IC ruler in the fourth house example.
mhm,
And the one that I did find, it's someone who just doesn't get it, just doesn't see the difference, because fourth house stuff for them is like really crappy, and their IC is in Taurus, and it should be like a little bit better, but their IC rulers in Aries, and so they're wrapped up together in this weird way. But
mhm,
if you kind of pull it out, you look at the fifth house significations, you look at the exaltation ruler of the IC as well as the domicile ruler. This is such a potent piece of the puzzle.
mhm,
And then you see that the third house gets pulled in, and Pisces gets pulled in, and their ascendant does, and there's this whole story that their fourth house is kind of literally hot and painful to the touch, right? But when you pull out the IC and you reckon with it alongside fourth house stuff, when you're like, okay, this is painful, this is literally part of your IC signature that fourth house stuff is painful, right?
mhm.
And then it just opens it up so you can find connections in all the other ways, and the ways that the houses relate together through their chart, through their rulers. And yeah, it's juicy.
Yeah, totally. Um, so let's before we get into the examples, maybe let's give some significations and some meanings of the fourth house and the IC in order to ground the basic and most fundamental symbolic meanings of those things in astrology, and therefore what sort of things we would expect to find if this technique works once we start seeing the IC importing those significations into different whole sign houses. So, what are some of our primary topics? I mean, for me, it's primarily like the parents traditionally and themes of family, and then secondarily the home and the living situation, and also finally like the private life, because the fourth is opposite to the 10th, which is the most visible and public part of the chart. So the fourth is like the most hidden part of the chart, and symbolically it's also the place that is under the earth, but below our feet from our perspective astronomically. So a lot of the significations come from there.
Hmm. Yeah, the if you when you're thinking about the geometry of it, there's the IC, and then there's the point that's square, the ascendant descendant is always going to be in the fourth and the 10th. And I think that that's like a really helpful way to sort of think about it. The question that we asked in our survey, this is considering the IC as our home, parents, roots, tethers, ancestors, source, familial stories, and experiences. How do you see the IC importing those topics into the whole sign house that it falls in your chart? Then are there any significant overlaps? And I feel like that's like for a lot of people, their kind of their roots and their tethers and this sort of supportive mycelium soil is in their biological family lineages, or adoptive of course, but the family lineages of the fourth house. But sometimes the family that ends up being important, that ends up being like the actual nourishing connective force in their life, is not their bio family, right? It is not the people they grew up with. Often with fifth house topics, and so this is just sort of expanding the keywords that we might think about, right? Is like chosen family comes up so much when it comes to
Mm.
fifth house ICs, and ancestors of culture, say, right? So if someone is an artist, say they're a dancer, the lineage of dancers before them ends up being really important to their life. And third house, it's the siblings is certainly a huge one that constantly comes up, but those siblings take on take on that like familial fourth housey kind of root system, right? So many of the third house examples that we received are third house IC examples that we received are people who in some way were parentified, right? Like they became a parent, or there was one of their siblings kind of became their parent while they were growing up. And that's very common for that third house IC topic. And also, that one thing that really comes up, and I think this has to do with the fact that throughout history, our places of worship, like where we gathered together to worship and experience devotion and togetherness in that way, religion and spirituality, were in our neighborhood, right? Like that's we went to the church because the church was within walking distance for the kids, right? And I
Mhm.
think the third house, so often in third house ICs especially, people end up connecting to that familial root system sort of that we associate with the fourth house, that is a fourth house topic, ends up in part being within their religious traditions and within their spiritual connections. And that's also something that when we kind of expand out these keywords, they are like those things can be fourth house too if they overlap, right?
Mhm.
And then they're also they are so just IC stuff, because that can the way that it moves through is it really adds to our grab bag of topics.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So and then I know we're going to go through each houses, so maybe we'll present a synthesis of significations at the top of each house, but I just want to make sure we're really clear about so our primary significations for the IC in this episode is we're talking about home, parents, roots, tethers, ancestors, source, familial stories and experiences, and then I would add just like the private life. And actually, I need to add a couple other ones for that really came up in the fourth house one, which is sometimes matters surrounding the end of life or even death and mortality can come up in in the fourth slash IC more often than you might think, like endings. And then the final one was, what was the final one? I guess it's just yeah, that idea of that which is not just private, but also ideas of that which is hidden, or even ideas of secrecy can come up because it is that lowest, most hidden part of the chart that's under the feet astronomically and therefore not visible. So sometimes it's that which is behind the scenes and not visible, even though it's sometimes playing a very important role in managing things.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely the hiddenness is, I mean, we literally, you can't see the IC. And I mean, I had Christina Mantinen, who is a practicing astrologer in Finland, who's practiced for 40 years. She pointed out to me while we were doing this research that in certain very, very northern places in Scandinavia, or basically places that are circumpolar, the IC can actually go above the horizon because it is those days that the midsummer or the solstice days where the sun doesn't even go above the horizon or doesn't set, right? And so there's these
Right.
really extreme moments where even when it's above the horizon, it's still not visible because the horizon is not visible at those moments in the
Mm,
sky that we're actually looking at. And so I think understanding the IC as this place, I often talk about it like you can't actually even really look at it. And this is part of why, there's not that much in the literature on it. There's not that much, being done on it, is because you kind of have to, it's kind of like feeling around in the dark and seeing what you bump up against, right? Rather than being able to, so as much as like the technique gives us these magical, mysterious ways to be able to access the IC, like we're doing today, right? In order to understand these narratives. At the same time, the IC itself is this place of mystery. It is this place of secrets, and it's often things that I say in the book. It's like that's partially like there's some demons down there. I mean, there's demons everywhere in the chart, but there's like some rough ones down there, and a lot of people are kind of scared to look down there, which, and sometimes for good reason, but oftentimes those stories that come with the IC, those really scary ones, like they're also protective, right? In this sort of mycelium immune system kind of way that supports our whole being and all the experiences we go through.
right. Yeah, for sure. There was I remember in the big fourth house episode we did last year, there was one story of a famous person who was trans, but they were a musician and they wanted to play in musician circles, so they had to pass as a man, and they grew up their entire life essentially like trying to passing as a man, and then when they passed away, their family discovered they were trans, which was a surprise and made a media sensation at the time. But they had a lot of stuff going on in their fourth house, and so it was a really tangible example of that idea of secrets, or that which is hidden, sometimes being really important in a person's life, because sometimes there's, in that instance, there was like, wanting to achieve their career dreams and their passion for music. And only one way to do that was to keep that like a part of themselves secret, for example, and to hide that, because they otherwise could either not be able to pursue their passion and their dreams, or otherwise could face dangers, like actual like threats to their life. So that was a really stunning example I remember in the fourth house episode that impressed on me sometimes the importance of the hidden aspect of things occasionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it can be literally scary down there for sure. And the fourth house itself can carry so much power. I mean, being the end of the matter, right? Being the end of life, and also um, the even just the association with real estate is, that in this world is associated with private property. And when we're in a homelessness crisis, right, and a housing crisis and scarcity, it's the fourth house becomes a really loaded place in many, many people's charts. And the IC takes on quite a bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Are there any other fourth house things that we should summarize as just really important meanings that you got to or focused on, especially in the book, before we jump into the chart examples and start going through the houses?
I think that covers most of it, especially when we start getting into the examples and we start seeing how these things play out through people's lives.
Okay, excellent. All right. So, how are we going to do this? We're going to go through. You want to go through the smaller houses first, or do you want to go through that's the route?
Yeah, so I think maybe a little bit of like astronomical context might be helpful. So it is possible for the IC to be, it's most often in the third, fourth, or fifth house. And sometimes it's in the second or the sixth, although those only happen at extreme latitudes and they're quite rare. So I just have a couple examples from each of those from the people who wrote in. And I think they can kind of go together as being these sort of extreme outliers that we can see. And we can kind of see that a little bit in their stories. And then and then we can move on to sort of a more robust discussion of the much more common third house and fifth house.
Okay. So I
So,
like that idea of showing astronomically. Let me show a chart really quickly for like
yeah.
the moment to demonstrate that. So here is the chart. I'll back it up for now here in Denver for when we started with we started with late Sagittarius rising. This is our election today. And so let's say this chart, for example, Sagittarius is rising, like late Sagittarius is rising, which means Sagittarius is the first whole sign house. Capricorn, therefore, because it's the second sign, is the second whole sign house. Aquarius is the third house, and Pisces is the fourth whole sign house. So most of our fourth house significations are showing up there in Pisces in the entirety of that sign from 0 to 30 degrees. But one of the unique things about whole sign houses is we find the degree of the IC in this instance over at 21 degrees of Aries. So it's in the fifth whole sign house. And therefore, according to the theory of the technique, we would see an importing of, let's say, fourth house significations into the fifth whole sign house where there's a doubling up. And one of the things that's interesting and unique about the whole sign perspective is it doesn't just start at the IC, even though the IC is going to definitely be the most sensitive point where there would be a culmination of fourth house significations. But really, the fourth house significations that are being imported from the IC start at the beginning of the sign and last until the end of the sign. So that's a really important conceptual thing we need to
Mhm.
convey that in this approach, the IC acts as a sensitive point in the same way that the lot of fortune or the ascendant act as sensitive points, which is to say that they are sensitive points that mark or designate the entirety of the sign that they fall in with their significations. So that's how, for example, the lot of fortune was used in ancient astrology, where whatever sign it falls in, that entire sign gets marked with lot of fortune significations, or the degree of the ascendant, because it falls in 28 degrees of Sagittarius in this chart, it marks the entirety of Sagittarius with first house significations, all the way from 0 degrees of Sagittarius to the last degree. So that's an important part of the conceptual model that is good to convey at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about the way transits work to it as well, like thinking about the IC as this culmination point, right? And so when we're working at it with transits, it's like the whole sign of approach activates the IC in a way, and then
Mm,
of course fades out as it moves through the rest of the sign. But that's a really thinking about them as these sensitive points because it is kind of a node, right? Like it is a place where the ecliptic and the meridian contact each other. And of course, the midheaven is the one we can see, and in this chart, it's in the 11th house. And so having with Venus right there, so sweet. I've loved these charts. Um,
yeah, this is our
and
election today.
yeah, and so of course there's a lot of ways that people kind of shorthand define the midheaven and IC, right? And not necessarily the most astronomically accurate, but as like the midheaven being, say, like the highest point in the sky. Like that's kind of true, but depending on what time of day you're looking at, it's not necessarily the highest the midheaven is going to get in that day because it's the way it's like the ecliptic moves. Well, we move, of course, but the ecliptic goes, it looks like it moves from east to west as the sun moves around. And then the meridian is what is just our north-south line. Straight. So here for me, it's like this is south. And so we have this north-south line. And wherever they meet, and of course this changes unless we're on the equator, this changes connected to what season of the year we're in. And so the midheaven rises and lowers in itself and moves through the sky. And so you can see it's always that southern point, but with the ecliptic moving, we see when we move the chart forward, the midheaven also moves through the zodiac.
Right. And that's a really important point. I'll animate it in just a second, but that this is where the crux of the issue, and this is the issue that has to be resolved, that we've been working on over the past 20 years, and have been taking steps to articulate better. But the issue, as you just pointed out, is like the meridian, which is what we call, let's say, the degree of the MC, which is the floating point that we'll be talking about, is like the north-south line, basically. Like the meridian points to where north is, basically. And the planets reach their highest elevation at the degree of the MC. So there's some sense of reaching the highest point of something with the degree of the MC, and also some notion of it being associated with north and the north-south axis. However, the 90-degree point, once you find the degree of the ascendant, which is the eastern horizon, the point that's exactly 90 degrees from that, which in this chart, since 28 degrees of Sagittarius is rising, that means 28 degrees of Virgo would be the 90-degree point. That's actually the 90-degree point if you're like standing on the earth and you look directly overhead. That's actually what you would find. And the fixed stars, for example, around that point are what you would see if you look directly upwards. And the ancient Mesopotamian astrologers would use those 90-degree point stars in order to tell time at night. So there's this secondary similar overlap of meaning of like the stars that are at the top of the sky, or the part of the sky that is directly above your head. And that's the fundamental symbolic and conceptual. You could either frame it as a conflict here, where we have two separate points that are representing similar overlapping significations of like 10th house midheaven significations. Or you could say, if it's not a conflict, you could say that there's a 2 points in the sky fundamentally that have similar and complementary and overlapping meanings, and therefore it's not just one thing or the other, which is the trap that astrologers want to fall into. And it's why some of the house division debates get so intense, because each astrologer that just adopts one approach, like if you're just adopting the like quadrant house systems, the midheaven very obviously, symbolically, and in chart work does represent 10th house things. And that is a experience that is very obvious and strongly felt, because astronomically and symbolically it does have some of those notions of culmination and highest elevation of planets and things like that. But then people that work with whole sign also see that the 10th whole sign house, the zodiacal sign that was culminating at the moment of birth, also shares and carries these 10th house highest point, most public and visible point significations as well. And so part of the goal here, and what you and I are doing today, is we're showing one of the best ways that we've found to reconcile that, which is taking into account both and recognizing it's not an either or situation, but in fact, both are true at the same time. And what's, sorry, one last thing before that approach is not something we're just inventing, but this approach is actually something Vedius Valens talked about in the second
Yes.
century and outlined. And that's why for 20 years now, I've been using this approach in the first place, because when I read the full anthology back in 2005, Valens has this chapter in like book 5 of the anthology where he starts talking about exactly this approach and outlining this notion of the degree of the MC, importing 10th house significations and doubling up into whatever whole sign house it falls. So already in Valens, he's reconciling these two different frameworks, and he's showing you the path forward to using both by recognizing that they both share similar significations and can be used together rather than something that's in competition. And there's something really beautiful and elegant about that.
Totally. Yeah, I'm very much a secret third thing coded person in basically every every aspect of my life, including
Right.
my astrological techniques. And actually, my natal chart, which we're not going to share today, but it is this problem because my sun is actually square my ascendant descendant, but my actual midheaven is in the far other side of the sign. So in quadrant house systems, I'm firmly a ninth house sun, but anyone who knows me, like there's 10th house equalities to my Virgo sun, like absolutely. And that square to the ascendant descendant is this exactly. It has there's so much going on with it. And I think squares to the midheaven IC, of course, are that same thing if we take it from the north-south axis. And of course, for anyone who wants to understand more of the astronomy, I highly recommend going on YouTube and looking up astronomy lectures on the celestial sphere, and that will explain this meridian, the celestial equator stuff, all this stuff. And of course,
Mm.
this changes whether you're in the northern and southern hemisphere as well. But the midheaven IC is always that northern southern thing, no matter like whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, it just changes what it looks like. And I think there's something really potent about being able to um, understand squares to the angles as just as active points as the angles themselves. And of course, this is square to the midheaven IC is the vertex anti-vertex, which I don't work a lot in that frame in my practice, but squares to the midheaven IC are a very classically slept on function, I think, when people are looking at their transits and their perfections and any other timing technique that activates the zodiac, basically. So I think that doing what we're doing here, yeah, it really brings out how those techniques really do function. Like it's almost always the secret third thing when you're actually talking to people and working with people's lives, and I really value that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes there's a learning curve to get like used to that and getting used to being
Totally.
able to comfortable working with that sort of ambiguity sometimes. But once you do, and once you truly unlock it, it just allows for all of this complexity and this nuance to come out, and you start seeing the shades of gray and the in-betweens and things like that, and it just creates such a richer backdrop for doing chart
Mhm.
delineations. So one last thing
Yeah.
I'll
Oh, yeah.
mention. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, for people who aren't more familiar with my work, it's like I sort of have this simultaneous education in like traditional Hellenistic revival as well as more psychological and archetypal lineages as well. And so even though when you're talking to me, I basically base all my delineations on whole sign houses, I'm usually actually looking at a Placidus chart when I'm looking at a chart in a consultation session because I love seeing the angles as they are because I understand it to be like representative of the actual sky and the horizon, right? But I'm blending these understandings of the whole sign houses, of the squares to the angles, of understanding the midheaven and IC as these floating important points. And I think that I don't know, there's just a very generative way to think about that. It's very mercurial Jupiterian, which I definitely am, but it's yeah, That's delicious, honestly, when it comes to astrology.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the ways. It's one of the reasons that it's harder to study the history of whole sign houses and when whole sign houses fell out of usage, because I think a
Mm.
lot of the astrologers from the medieval and Renaissance periods were like you in that they would cast a quadrant chart to have the quadrant house positions, but like they would just obviously implicitly be able to understand what the whole sign positions were at the same time because you just count the signs. And so sometimes when you go back and look and people are like, well, we don't see a whole sign chart in such and such author, it's because like it's such a simple and like basic concept. But like you, sometimes it makes more sense to cast a quadrant chart and then just to infer the secondary positions on top of that.
Yeah, I think counting signs from the ascendant is also a skill that especially beginner astrologers should definitely get in the habit of, because once you do that, you can do derivative houses, you can do fortune houses like very easily, just all in your head. And that's one of the sort of pet beginner techniques that I think. And basically when you do that, you're using whole sign houses, no matter what kind
Mm.
of chart you're looking at. And yeah, I think that's totally accurate in terms of this used to just be normal. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and there's like one chart example where like Marinus does that, and he talks about it, and it gives you
Mm.
a peak that sometimes like that approach persisted much longer into the tradition. That's in like the 17th century than you might expect. So there was one last point to make about that. What I wanted to state was I think part of what we're talking about here, I always come back to and have been developing over the past 10 years is what I call the mercurial nature of astrology, which is that, astrology was always traditionally represented by Mercury. And part of that is that astrologers are acting as interpreters and translators of the language of the stars and the sky. But also, there's a very practical reason for that I see come up over and over again in astrology, which is that we often run into these dilemmas in astrology that seem like dilemmas where we have two different, majorly seemingly competing ways of doing some specific technical thing, where you almost, it seems like an either or situation, and astrologers sometimes come down really hard in picking one approach or the other. But so oftentimes I think the answer to this is just going back to realizing that astrology is a mercurial or mercury based thing. And with Mercury, it's whenever you have those things, it's always it's not necessarily either or, but it's both. And so we see that sometimes with like, tropical versus sidereal, or whole sign versus quadrant houses, or there can be like major aspects versus minor aspects, or what have you. It just comes up over and over again, these seemingly contrasting things where it's like, how can two things be true at once? And so people aren't used to thinking like that because it's not our normal way, not everyone's normal way of thinking. But it's something I think that's really valuable and important for astrologers to get used to thinking because it is inherent to the very nature of astrology.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm definitely in the astrology as divination school, and being an astrologer as being a diviner, and that it's more than translation. Like, yes, it is translation, but it's more than translation. And that so often every translator knows that there's a million ways to translate something, right? And it depends on, of course, the context. And when we're working with clients, it depends on their lived experience and what they're working with. And this is yeah, music to my ears for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Let's jump into it. Let's get into this.
Yeah.
We're gonna start. You want to start with the second house, right?
Hmm.
Oh yeah, did I mention? I'll get to that later, but let's start with the second house. And so second house significations for me are things like money, possessions, material things associated with the person's life, like wealth and other things like that. Are there any other second house significations you usually throw in?
Yeah, I think I take a pretty expansive idea of resources,
Mm,
which of course is material wealth and income kind of, and there's a being in the second house, that below the horizon, next to the first. There is this idea of agency when it comes to those things versus the eighth, which is so similar, but that's like other people's agency when it comes to material wealth and things. So I do see things about the body and land coming up in second house too, even though those might be things we give to the first or the fourth. Those can come up, and I think especially in the culture we're living in, where that's tends to be so optimized and so productivity oriented. The idea of material wealth and income is often tied into one's body and one's health, and so those things can come up when we're talking to people as well when it comes to second house topics.
got it. All right. So let's share our first chart example, which is by a listener or
Mhm.
somebody that filled out the form named Johanna, right?
Yeah, Johanna lives in Helsinki, Finland. So, Johanna's the person who actually alerted me to the fact that it's actually quite common up there, right? Right, in these extreme latitudes, for people to have their IC in the first house as well. So we ended up adding that as an option. We didn't get any examples, but she showed me a couple, and that she just knows on her own. And Johanna's chart is, I love it. If you put this date and time into Stellarium software to see the actual sky,
Hmm.
you can see how the sun and the Uranus are in relationship to each other at the sort of like highest point in the sky. If anyone wants to be a real nerd and go all the way for it. So I'm actually just going to read what Johanna wrote because I think it's so indicative. I guess we could go through what we're looking at here as well, right? So we have this
Yeah.
Cancer
Just
IC,
so yeah,
and
just for the audio listeners. So
mhm,
Gemini rising, Cancer, I see.
yeah, and Johanna has a moon in Sag right below the descendant, and then a separating from a square from Saturn and Pisces in the 10th, which also feels kind of relevant. The ascendant ruler for her Gemini ascendant is a stationary Mercury in Aquarius, conjunct Mars in the ninth, which also feels relevant to her story.
Okay.
So, um, so Johanna shares, I was born in 1994 into a family in the midst of a major recession in Finland, which was caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union and earlier financial market liberalization and foreign currency loans. A large number of Finns became heavily over indebted and lost all their assets. My family was one of them, as my grandparents were merchants and my aunt's husband was an entrepreneur. My relatives lost practically all their property during the recession, and some of them were still repaying debts well into the 2020s. So, of course, with the IC in the second house, this puts the midheaven in the eighth house. So, would be a generational signature that people with this Uranus Neptune in Capricorn of her generation being living in Finland at this time would be living with. Um, from a young age, I had a feeling that I could be the one to get an education, become wealthy, and pay off my family's debts, even though as a child I didn't understand any of it. I've never received any money from my parents, but I've always been generous and tried to help my over indebted relatives throughout my life. I started doing occasional jobs at the age of 13 to build up my own assets, and later I went on to study economics to better understand the causes of the 1990s recession and the mistakes made in handling it. Of course, I also thought that if I became an economist, I could get a well paying job. I've always been interested in Finnish history, especially my family's history. Because we had no property, we also had no history. Our family's farms, houses, and cottages had been repossessed. And so here I think we can see another piece around that. Looking at the fourth house as distinct from the second here.
Hmm.
So the fourth house is Virgo, and so sharing her ascendant ruler is also that Mercury with Mars in the ninth in Aquarius.
Right.
Um, as a
And
child,
she,
Yeah.
is motivated by her family situation to like go to
Hmm.
school and study economics, which is like a ninth house thing.
Yeah, and then also seeing that being that eighth house midheaven being ruled by that Saturn in Pisces in the 10th,
Mhm.
and had being in that square to that moon, which is her IC ruler.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But the focal point is just have with the IC,
Yeah.
which is importing home and family significations into the
Hmm.
second whole sign house of money and
Yeah.
finances. That was a major like foundational thing early in her life was the unstable family financial situation.
And this thing that completely, it wasn't just family financial struggles, right? It completely uprooted not only her national identity, which is also something that we often associate with the fourth, right? But
Mm.
so bringing that into that second house and really just like entangling them completely together so that it impacted her entire life. She also shares a cute note here too, speaking to her moon. So her spouse's sun and Mercury is in Cancer exactly on her IC, which is
Nice.
so cute. Um, and there's one piece I want to pull out from her story as well. And one thing that's funny, part of the reason she submitted is because, of course, my name Pallas. There's a national park wildlife reserve in Lapland in Finland called Pallas Tunturi, which is an essential part of her story and is part of why she's an example here because it's just so beautiful. So when we're thinking about the IC as a sensitive point, I feel like this is maybe the only example we have here of a transit or a lunation, eclipses especially, but lunations as well, activating the point of the IC and making really wild things happen. So um, she writes, in 2023, the new moon in Cancer aligned exactly with my IC. At the time, I was living with my partner, of course, this moon ruler of the IC in the seventh, in a rented apartment in Helsinki on the verge of burnout because I couldn't finish my university thesis after transitioning into full time work. More second house stuff. Due to the war in Ukraine, interest rates rose significantly in Finland, and many private real estate investors were forced to sell their investment properties. That happened to us at the end of 2022, and shortly after the new moon in August 2023. Oh, yeah, the new moon in August 2023. Our landlord, right, more eighth house stuff, informed us that we had to move out because he was selling the apartment. We decided to move to Lapland and work remotely from there for a year. I wanted to reconnect with my roots as my grandparents were originally from Lapland, and the moon happened right around the full moon in Cancer, up before Christmas. In Lapland, I found my extended family with whom contact had been lost and discovered that my grandfather's childhood home from 1909 was still standing. This is extremely rare as Nazi Germany burned down almost all buildings in Finnish Lapland during World War II, making the house a valuable part of our cultural heritage. Living in the middle of the Palestinturi Fells for a year helped me recover from burnout, and I found a sense of home. Located about 250 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, Palestinturi offered a truly wonderful experience. Surrounded by the serene silence of Arctic nature, the untouched wilderness, northern lights, and crisp mountain air, I felt deeply connected to something timeless and healing. It was in that vast, quiet landscape that I rediscovered both my roots and myself.
Wow.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. Thinking about that Saturn ruling the midheaven, eighth house squaring the moon as IC ruler in the seventh, like moving with your partner because you get evicted and finding yourself in the like Arctic mountains.
Yeah. So there was definitely with the lunations that were happening on the IC in the second house, there were financial things that were happening at that time in terms of needing to work full time in order to make money and pay bills, and then having weird things start happening with the home and living situation due to the landlords at the time, and having this push for a move and a relocation with the partner that leads to reconnecting with one's roots and one's familial tradition in some ways.
Mm, such a beautiful example. Such
Yeah.
a like, yeah. I mean, I haven't seen that many second house IC examples, even in my client work when I was doing my research. So being able to see these and everyone who submitted them was really special.
Yeah, and it's important because it's sometimes it's through the timing things like like
Mm-hmm.
she was sharing, that you really see it come out at the same time because you start seeing overlapping, in this instance, like second house and fourth house significations becoming prominent in the life in the same way, in a way that's overlapping and reinforcing each other. So um, I did mean to, yeah, there. I did mean to say that even though in this instance, for example, while there's the entire sign is marked with fourth house or with IC and fourth house significations in Cancer, as well as second house significations. The IC is a sensitive point. There is almost like a graph that you could draw where there's an intensity that kind of like
Yes,
peaks at the degree of the IC and then declines afterwards. But it
absolutely.
so it marks the entire sign with IC significations, whatever sign it's importing those fourth house significations into. But the actual degree and the degrees surrounding it are often experienced, especially in transits, as a period of heightened intensity with respect to the IC significations.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, so we'll see that come up more. Okay, awesome. Well,
Mm-hmm. So,
thanks to
yeah.
Joanna for submitting that. That was a great example.
So next we have, this is our second and last second house example. It's Amber. And she's in, or was born in Aberdeen, Scotland in 1991. Should we be reading the birth information out for the for the audio
No,
listeners? No. Okay.
that's okay. Let's just skip it. We'll just, especially
Cool.
because we want to get through, if we want to get through our 20 examples, let's just keep it concise to,
Yeah. Sounds
especially
great.
the IC placement.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, so this is another Gemini rising Cancer IC example. We have a moon in Capricorn, of course, in the eighth with the midheaven. And Amber shares material wealth and income for me is like trying to collect water with a sieve. No matter how easily it flows, it always slips away. I've always had a steady job, yet any kind of material abundance remains elusive, diluted by a tide of hobbies, distractions, and quiet timidity that keeps me from expanding my horizons in the tangible world. So, second house ruled by the moon in detriment, the maternal element looms large. My relationship with my mother was tense growing up. I often felt like a fish out of water, never quite the daughter she wanted, though I can't fault her for her financial generosity in times of need. So, we see this moon, icy ruler moon in the eighth with the North Node, right? Offering generosity, but not necessarily the kind that Amber felt she needed, which is not an uncommon thing. And that South Node on the IC in the second house itself being this sieve that she talks about where her own ability to make money feels, she says, these issues have always felt amplified, even against what could otherwise be seen as a very fortunate life.
Okay. So yeah, there's some financial things as well as a little bit of like self-worth type things that are tied up with
Hmm.
the IC being in the second house.
Yeah, and one other thing she shares, often in unexpected ways, she does end up being frequently gifted or inherited things. So, for example, during one failed attempt to move abroad, a stranger gave me $50 when I had nothing left, enabling me to get to my half sister's house. Or when my partner and I moved into an unfurnished flat after a no fault eviction, right? More eviction things. His mother gifted us an entire living room setup. So, and on a more permanent note, my parents have put their house in my name, so I will inherit it. Probably my only tangible asset, which is ironic given my lifelong desire to get away.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Nice. Absolutely.
feels so spot on.
That's good. And something we should mention, I forgot to mention that in the for the structure of the actual survey itself, that we asked people two primary questions, basically, or there were three fields, and the first field was like um, the first field said what if any, like ways if your IC falls outside of the fourth whole sign house, how do IC significations overlap with the
Mm.
significations of the house that it falls in any notable ways? And that's like the first paragraph we're reading. And then the second question we asked was, what house is the ruler of your IC placed in? And do you see any overlaps or connections between the IC house and that whole sign house that it's in, and the house that the ruler is in. And this is where some of the additional delineations are coming from.
Yeah. Yeah,
Cool.
really,
Okay.
really. People did so well. I was so impressed with everyone. So we'll go into six house ICs because these are the other examples of ones that are very not common, and you have to be the upper latitudes in the northern hemisphere, up in Scandinavia are quite populated, right? And quite a few English speakers, and I guess people who are into astrology, which is cool. So we did get a number of second house and sixth house examples from that. So our next
So,
example is Joe.
uh,
This
s-
is the one.
so, real
Sorry.
quick,
Yeah.
sixth house significations, real quick.
Yes.
For me are things like work, health, illness, and sometimes subordinates or people that work for you can come up in the sixth house.
Yeah, servitude for sure, I think is one that comes up, and that can be something when we're dealing with IC stuff. Like more often, I've seen like IC rulers in the sixth. There can be inherited experiences of that, and the way that the trauma of servitude, and of course, in some examples like literal slavery, which is a sixth house association traditionally. How that can be passed through the trauma of that through family lines is
Mm,
something that can come up in six health examples. Um,
okay.
yeah, so this is the one that we don't want to share, the place.
Place. Okay, so let me just get rid of the data altogether then, and I will just share the chart itself,
Great.
which is a chart with Sagittarius rising, and the IC is in Taurus in the sixth whole sign house.
Yes, so this is a quick one, but I wanted to share this one because this was not the only Sag Ascendant Taurus sixth house IC that we received that had an association with a family farm. And one of the other ones was literally a family dairy farm. So when we're thinking about Taurus, that is very, very, very spot on, and the sixth house as well. Um,
Right. And the
oh, sixth
sixth,
house also being domestic animals too.
that's what I was just thinking. It was also,
Yeah.
we often find animals and like pets in the sixth house.
And 12th house too, of course, with like larger animals as well, being, I think cows are probably sort of one in the other. They belong in both houses, different times. But so
Mm.
Amber, just real quick, shares, my generation is the 10th on the same farm, very, very far north. A very practical family with seasonal routines, maybe not emotionally present, but practical and reliable, always helping each other. And with the ruler of Taurus is Venus, of course. And Joe's Venus is at 1 degree Virgo, right, near the top of the chart, even though it's quite far from the 12th house midheaven. And she shares Venus is in my 10th, and I work with remediation of soil, removing hidden pollution, cleaning, tidying, generational pollution projects from the subsurface of the soil. Like,
Wow.
just so good.
Incredible.
I
I
love
like, I
that.
like,
Yeah.
I like that. I like also the simplicity of the initial delineation of just like the IC importing family significations into the sixth house, and the
Yes.
family has run a farm for 10 generations. So it's like literally the family and animals are the two primary archetypes coming together there in this instance.
Yeah. And I mean, we can also see some actual fourth house whole sign significations too, being like, say, the real estate aspect of it, right? Because it's Pisces in her chart, and Jupiter is in dignified in Sagittarius in her first house as well, which is just
Mhm.
like, that is a fortunate, um, a fortunate familial connection in terms of, so this one, some of the other examples as well, we can see this is a quite positive, albeit maybe not emotionally present, right? But there is a way that seeing the condition and placement and angularity of the IC sign rulers will often show not just the circumstances, but then how people feel toward the circumstances, right? Which we've seen that in a couple of
Mm,
these examples so far, where it's like might be quite fortunate circumstances, but how it actually lands is not so appreciated depending on other factors.
yeah, people sometimes sometimes like intermediate astrology students struggle with that sometimes. Well, they'll have a placement in a certain part of their chart that's supposed to mean something, but there'll be like a maltreatment, or there'll be something tricky about it, and it will actually be indicating a negation of those topics, rather than an affirmation of those. So saying no to it rather than saying yes. And people will sometimes struggle with that because they assume the placement is always supposed to be an affirmative, but sometimes what's being indicated in your chart is like a negation, or that you won't do that thing, or that you won't feel good about that thing, or that there's a problem there in some way.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have one more sixth house example, and that's the Cap Rising one.
Okay.
And this is an
Pull up the,
example from Norway.
and this is okay to share the data.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is Capricorn rising and with a Gemini sixth house IC.
Okay.
So she shares, what I inherited and struggle with the most is the servitude work ethic of both my parents. I've always sacrificed my physical needs to serve others. My father worked as a carpenter but got partly disabled due to injuries from the work wearing him out. He was not good at taking care of himself, eating or rest wise. My mother had to change jobs to a consultant desk job from being a nurse, which is also taking a toll on her, and she always works overtime. So there is a Venus on the IC is here, but it's still in the sixth house, right? And so those difficulties of that servitude, and then of course of illness, being another sixth house one that we didn't mention, being well, maybe we did, but being very, very prominent often. And so I see in the sixth being parents that overwork themselves to the point of illness feels very, very spot on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very literal and makes a lot of sense.
So the ruler of the IC here, bringing in a little bit of the fifth house example, because the ruler of that IC is Mercury in Taurus, which is very close to the sun, combust in the fifth house, and so. Cap Rising studied art in 20s, and drawing and art in general has always dealt with the themes such as daily routines, daily life, and work. I find the most inspiration at my work and have made several drawing portraits of my colleagues and my working space. Work was also very fun for me. I really love to work, but I have a hard time finding jobs that are compatible with my own health.
Mm.
So,
Brilliant.
also just inherited illness and relationship to family is like such a potent piece of this part too.
Yeah, because there's a mutual reception here where
Mm-hmm.
Gemini is the sixth whole sign house and also contains the IC, and it's ruled by Mercury, which is in Taurus in the fifth whole sign house. And then the ruler of the fifth house is Venus, which is placed in the sixth whole sign house, conjunct the degree of the IC. Whenever there's an exchange of signs between the house rulers, we've seen this over and over again in the houses series, that it creates a strong connection between those two areas of the life. And this is a really good, vivid example of that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, her own work being fun as well, because we have the other benefic is Jupiter in Scorpio in her 11th house, ruling the 12th house midheaven, which is also where her moon is. And that feels like that brings in some of that joy to her work as well, even if it's probably, and she didn't share, but it's even probably in 12th house topics, or will be eventually.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's the sixth house. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's it for second and sixth.
Okay. So those are the two, in terms of the majority of the charts that we collected, in terms of where the majority of our audience is. I think those are the outlier houses that we want to start with first. But the majority of examples that we have, and the majority of people have the IC either in the fourth whole sign house, or in the third whole sign house, or in the fifth whole sign house. So that is what we're going to talk about next. And um, shall we start with the third house?
Oh yeah. Oh, third house is so rich. I feel like it's one of the houses that people often have some trouble with, because it seems like the significations don't really connect, but when you get to that root of like the joy of the moon, I feel like it really connects so much of the third house.
Yeah, for sure. So when we did the third house series, it was like communication was a core one, but also siblings, relatives, neighbors, the city that you live in and the surrounding neighborhood. Sometimes friends came up with a third house, especially like local friends or friends that you grew up with in your neighborhood as a result of proximity. And finally, short distance travel and like traveling around your city and your local environment and things like that were all very prominent themes.
Yeah, and bringing in that neighborhood vibe too with like the idea